welcome you all to our second last RFP workshop of the fall term. Next week we have Pam Oliver from the Department of Sociology talking about incarceration. She's one of our affiliates. But today we're very lucky to have the first in our series, the Center for Financial Security IRP series, Sensing on Assets and Financial Literacy and so forth. One of the disadvantaged, and Mike Collins, who most of you know, is the director of the Center for Financial Security. Will introduce our speaker, Johnson.
Great, thanks, Tim. Well, I just want to thank IRP for helping make this series possible. We envisioned this last year. We talked to Social Security about just ways to engage more departments and researchers around campus around issues of financial and household finance and financial capacity building. So that we're doing 4 talks this year, 1 this semester and then 3 in the spring. First, the next one will be in February with Margaret Schrodden, and then we're having Jean Hogarth come in from the Federal Reserve Board. Potentially by that point in time, she may be over at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And then finally, a qualitative project from somebody at the San Francisco Fed. Thanks for coming. We hope you come to the other ones as well. I want to thank John for being here today. John is just a great thinker and a great researcher in this space. The financial literacy, financial capacity building, the household finance world has really evolved a great deal, I think, in the last 5-6 years, and John's really been at the forefront of that, using good methods and solid research techniques, field research. You may talk a little bit about his work with the IPA, which is a group where they've done some international development kind of experimental work, but really fantastic stuff. So really an honor to have you here today, so thanks very much. His bio, just so you all know, he's at Dartmouth now. He previously was at the Federal Reserve in Boston, is that right? Boston, New York. New York. PhD at MIT and bachelor's at Harvard. So he's been among the best and brightest and is now contributing to that as well. So we're going to hear a lot, I think, in the next hour and a half, and he's encouraged us to talk about these issues and raise questions. So I think you said there'll be a lot of half-baked ideas. So consider this the venue to try to put those out there, and we'll see where we go from there. So thanks, John.
That's right. Thanks. It's good to be here. One thing that's not in my bio is that I'm a Michigander, so it's always good to be back in the Midwest. So thanks to yeah, I'm a Spartan. Don't hold that against me. And we won't talk about the
You won't talk about that.
That's right. That's right. I'll probably hear a lot about the BCS. So anyway, yes, this is part of my effort to I guess cross-pollinate all 3 Social Security-funded financial literacy research centers. I'm affiliated with the BC one, even though I sit at Dartmouth, where I guess in theory Anna Luzzardi Center resides, and it's good to be here with you all. And so, as Michael said, so Michael asked me to give a talk on innovations, maybe with the behavioral slant on it. I don't even know if you asked for a behavioral slant. You're getting one. For changing savings behavior among LMI folks. Right? And I'm not very good at following directions. So I'm going to give a somewhat different and broader talk. And so it will focus, to the extent that this talk is focused at all, on savings behavior, but one of the things I want to hammer home, and am certainly focusing on in my work, is thinking holistically about decision making and financial decision making. All right, so and this applies to thinking about both sides of the household balance sheet, which, believe it or not, is sometimes viewed as a radical or innovative step in the academic finance world. Thinking about intertemporal choice across various domains, so psychologists would talk about, a health decision-making domain and a financial decision-making domain. There are, I think, some natural complementarities, and one of the things that economists strive to do is to build simple but hopefully robust and portable models that help us understand decision-making across different types of decisions. And also, and I'll talk less about this today, But clearly, people don't make savings decisions and don't make financial decisions in isolation. They often make them in or around markets where firms are competing for their business and where we need to think about market equilibrium. All right, and I think it's important to keep this stuff in mind, in part because this is, among the things that economists are relatively good at. All right, so we're not so. I realize there are people from various disciplines here, and I'd be the first to acknowledge that economists are not so good at a lot of things, and that's one reason why I'm particularly interested in trying to draw on some insights from psychology. But I think we are relatively good at thinking holistically about these sorts of things, and this is one thing, sort of one recurring theme of my work and of my talk today. And in keeping with this point about broadening the scope a bit, I won't just be thinking about or talking about today poor and LMI folks, and maybe I need to apologize for that given the audience, but the very motivation for a lot of this work that I've been doing, that's being done, trying to glean insights from the behavioral social sciences and turning them into applications that help people make better decisions, is that there is this evidence that people are prone to biases and decision-making limitations that affect very wide swaths of people. All right, so a lot of what I'm talking about, and although the jury is still out on the economic importance of a lot of these things in equilibrium, the motivation for worrying about this stuff comes from evidence suggesting that very wide swaths of people are prone to these various biases and limitations. All right? So these are all things that people seem to be prone to. How much they actually matter out there in the world is still very much a subject of debate. What we can do about it, what we should try to do about it, is still very much a subject of debate. I'll talk about all this, but I just want to say that the very thing, the very pieces of evidence that get us sort of going down this line of inquiry to begin with suggest that this is not just something that potentially affects poor people. It affects most people potentially. And then of course there's sort of what was happening to the. If we're thinking just about savings and savings rates, all you need to do is sort of go back immediately pre-meltdown and notice that the U.S. household saving rate was quite low, even negative. Again, suggesting that if we're going to worry about savings adequacy and savings behavior, this is something that probably applies to a lot of people, not just to people with low incomes. All right. And sort of given the potential for sort of broad implications here, I am focusing a lot in my own research, and I'll focus a lot today in thinking about sort of innovations and applications that are potentially scalable, that have the potential to pass some sort of market test, or if there's a policy implication, it's likely to be one that is relatively modest in the sense that it could be implemented cheaply, keeping in mind the very real resource constraints that we all face these days. All right, and so before I jump in, I just want to make clear that this is not meant to be anything resembling a comprehensive literature review. Mostly, I'm going to talk about what I'm working on and what I find interesting, and of course, this is informed by my admittedly incomplete state of literature, but particularly for the grad students in the room, you should not take this as anything I say today as gospel or meant to be comprehensive or any sort of substitute for a conscientious literature review. All right, and so not sure how much motivation we need here. I think this is my only motivating slide. I think we might start with the question of, well, do people save too little? Do people borrow too much? I think this is that's probably the question that gets us interested in giving or coming to a talk on innovations for changing saving behavior, right? And so I can't emphasize enough that the jury is very much still out on these questions, okay? I work on behavioral economics, not because I'm convinced that we already know the answers to these questions, but in part because I'm interested in trying to figure out the answers to these questions, which turns out are very thorny. And there is lots of behavioral theory and lots of evidence of what I would deem the largely circumstantial variety that says, yes, maybe not over the life cycle, but at various junctures in the life cycle, there is circumstantial evidence suggesting that people save too little and borrow too much and too expensively. All right? Now, let me just tell you the evidence that most motivates me, that I find most convincing. So for example, I'm not at all convinced or particularly interested in this descriptive evidence where you ask people survey questions about whether they're saving enough. Okay? I just think those are so full of pitfalls. I mean, saving and wealth are normal goods, and it's very easy for people to interpret those questions as, yeah, would I like to have more money in the bank? Well, sure. Right? So I'm not especially motivated by that kind of evidence, which, for reasons I don't fully understand, is often trotted out as being sort of a stylized fact that should motivate work like this. But I think there is some other types of evidence that gets one motivated to take these questions seriously. Many people do borrow expensively and serially. I think sort of the most prominent example, maybe in policy circles these days, is sort of serial borrowing using payday loans in the U.S. All right? And again, I'm not saying that's clearly not unambiguously a bad thing, but it gets one thinking about, well, do we really think these guys, sort of, if we equip them with the tools to make more deliberate and thoughtful decisions, would they really decide to do this, or might they want to come up with a way to do some precautionary saving instead of trying to deal with bad shocks by borrowing repeatedly from payday lenders? All right, gets one thing. I think some other evidence I find provocative, maybe because I have trafficked in developing this evidence, but borrowing decisions to borrow expensively, respond to what I think most people would view as economically irrelevant stimuli, like advertising content. Whether there's a picture of a woman on the piece of direct mail you get, whether the piece of direct mail you get mentions or does not mention what you could do with the loan, whether the piece of direct mail you get gives you one example of a type of loan you could get or 4 examples of a type of loan you could get. So that's an earlier paper from a field experiment with several co-authors. Victor Stango and I have a new paper that's not quite circulating yet, but will be soon, where we find that overdraft fees, these expensive penalty fees that people pay for going into the negative balances on their checking accounts, respond strongly and dynamically to taking surveys that do or do not have a question or two that mention bank overdrafts. So this is a paper sort of about limited attention and overdrafting. Sort of conditional on people selecting into surveys. We compare people who happen to take a survey that mentions something about bank overdrafts to people who take surveys that are otherwise pretty much identical, and the people who hear something about overdrafts are then much less likely to overdraft. Right? And these are short-term effects, but then they, as you take more of these surveys, these people sort of build up a stock, and overdraft fee payments get reduced in steady state with a little bit of appreciation. But anyway, okay, so that's another type of evidence that I find provocative and interesting. And then there's demand for commitment. which I think sometimes in my circles, in behavioral economic circles, is overstated, but it is there. And when you go out and offer new commitment devices like Justin does or like I do in some of my projects, people take them. Even when they've never encountered a sort of type of wacky product like this, where you're basically posting a performance bond that you're going to do something that you want the third party to seize if you don't do it. Or you're listing the names of peer supporters that you want the third party to contact if you don't follow through on your plan. You know, like 10% of people or 20% of people that you offer these wacky products to will take them. All right? And there's no demand for that sort of stuff in standard models, and that suggests that people are looking for ways to help them stick to their plans.
John, before you go on, I was looking at your CV. Did you write a paper that compared the cost of payday loans to the cost of bank overdrafts? And there's supposedly there's some interaction.
So I have not written such a paper. I guess I have a result in one of my papers that when you cut off access to payday loans, there's some evidence that people substitute into bank overdrafts, perhaps not surprisingly. And I mean, in terms of the costs, it depends how you want to measure them. I mean, because payday loans tend to be $15 per $100 borrowed over 2 weeks. Bank overdraft fees tend to be a flat fee, $30, $35, $40, regardless of how much you overdraft. But then there's some flexibility in when you pay it back. Although most people end up paying it back in about a week or so. So
this kind of interacts with the role of banks as institutions as compared to taking the cash and pay the loans and get it back. I mean, overdrafts mean that you're not coming back with your bank.
Absolutely, and typically getting a payday loan means you're banked. I mean, typically you can only get a payday loan if you have a checking account, because the lender is, taking that post-dated check as, think of it as collateral. You can think of it as a way to, economize on collection costs of transaction fees. Okay, and so here's what I plan to talk about. Quick overview of different types of behavioral models or theories of undersaving, all of which have some but hardly airtight empirical support. All right. And then development of innovations, applications, interventions, however you want to think about it, many of which are based on specific behavioral theories about how people might go astray and how we might sort of try to help people correct or mitigate those biases or decision-making limitations. That tends to be how I work when I'm doing field work. And even the innovations that weren't explicitly designed with particular behavioral limitations in mind can be understood as potential antidotes to specific behavioral biases, and not incidentally, we're all researchers here, and I think the most interesting applied research is stuff that not only tests applications, but uses that as an opportunity to test some underlying theory of decision making and or of how markets work and don't work. And again, that's sort of how I prefer to try to do my research, and so I'll be talking about various projects along those lines. And so I'll talk, absolutely inspired by Michael in this case, I'll be talking about different types of innovations that I'll loosely group into different, albeit somewhat, fluid bins of product innovations, process innovations, upfront disclosure and marketing, real-time information and reminders, sort of ongoing communication and messaging, and advice, market for advice. And then I promise, because someone asked me earlier today about what I think are the most important sort of big questions going forward, so I promise to end with my 5 slides on what I think are the 5 most exciting questions and areas for future research. All right, but so quickly, I think it helps to run through different, what I take to be, I think this is a fairly comprehensive list, sort of the leading behavioral theories or models of how and why people might go astray when making intertemporal decisions, and consequently might go astray when deciding how much or how to save or how much or how to borrow. Right? And so one class of theories, of course, probably familiar to most of you, is those featuring costly self-control. I guess the closest thing we have to a canonical way of modeling this is with dynamically inconsistent preferences, namely quasi-hyperbolic discounting. The main predictions here, most relevant for the talk today, is that people may end up not saving enough, they end up borrowing too much. This is because they always want to consume today. And if people are sophisticated about their self-control problems, if they're sophisticated about the fact that they always prefer to consume today and postpone saving until tomorrow, but they realize that if you gave them the same choice about a month from now versus a month plus 1 day from now, that they would prefer to be patient, well, this can, of course, lead to a demand for commitment. You try to tie your hands so that when you get to a month from now, you have effectively adopted the view that you would have adopted ex ante. You try to constrain yourself to be patient when the moment of truth arrives. All right, and so the main application or set of applications that come out of this is trying to come up with workable commitment devices, opportunities, basically coming up with ways to give people opportunities to voluntarily constrain their future behavior. Right? And one interesting and problematic feature of developing applications here is that commitment contracts only unambiguously improve the welfare of people who are fully sophisticated about the self-control problem they have. Right? Guys who are completely oblivious of the fact that they're always living for today have no demand for commitment. But most problematic is we have guys who may be sort of partly sophisticated about their self-control problem. And so they may demand commitment devices, but not know how to use them to make themselves better off. Right? And so that's problematic. And an issue I'll return to later. I should say, if you want to hear more or less about something, just please jump in and ask questions or urge me to move along. Like I said, this is meant to be a little bit of freewheeling and a little bit of insight into the work I'm doing and why I'm doing it, but I'm happy to take direction as we go along here. So another theory of undersaving, which, as I understand it, is not actually a theory of undersaving, but gets a fair amount of attention, so I thought it was worth a slide, is loss aversion. All right, so preferences over risk, where people are particularly averse to bad realizations. And so this can lead to sticky consumption levels. So for example, people are particularly averse to reducing consumption even when they get, or say discretionary consumption, even when they get a bad shock to their resource constraint. So it's hard, and I mentioned this in part because I'll be talking about Save More tomorrow as an application layer. And so in Save More tomorrow, definitely is interested in countering loss aversion, because it's hard to get people to save more when their incomes are flat and people have this loss aversion. But it sort of begs the question of, you know, income's flat with respect to what? Are we talking about real income or discretionary income? We have these very thorny issues with what the reference point is and how reference points set. You can only be loss averse with respect to some benchmark, with respect to some reference point. And so how those reference points get set and moved around is still very much in question. Justin's one of the few people to do good empirical work in the field on this. And it also begs the question of, well, you know, yes, maybe it's hard to move savings rates around given a fixed income, but, you know, shouldn't people have been saving enough to begin with? All right, so this, as I understand loss aversion, at least, and admittedly my understanding is far from comprehensive, it's not a full-blown theory of undersaving or overborrowing. Other theories or models of why people might undersave, limited attention, and limited attention models come in an overwhelming number of varieties, as I'll talk about later. So let me focus ideas. Limited attention to what? Well, one thing people may not pay attention to is penalty fees and other state contingent fees. So Gabax and Leibson have a nice model of this for the aspiring behavioral grad students out there in the audience on shrouded pricing. And this, you know, this sort of relates to the descriptive evidence that's out there on a lot of these folks who took adjustable rate mortgages during the housing bubble and apparently didn't realize the extent to which they were exposed to market risk, to interest rate risk from those adjustable provisions. All right, so that'd be an example of people not attending to an attribute that was not part of sort of the base price of the good, in this case, the mortgage. All right. I have another paper where we write down a simple little model of people not fully attending to future expenditure opportunities or needs. So think about, school fees isn't a good example in the US, but think about like soccer registration or hockey registration. I mean, you know, every year I'm like, oh my God, it's time to pay for the travel hockey team again. I can't believe, you know, it's like, where am I going to find that $1,000 this month? Car registration fees would be another example of this. And so the distinct predictions and applications that come out of these models of limited attention, or at least the ones that I like to work with, are that just reminding people can change behavior. Right? And also engaging people in some sort of process where they set goals and make plans can change behavior. Right? And one nice thing that I think makes these models of limited attention more tractable and less controversial when trying to develop applications for the real world is that the applications in theory will work on the least sophisticated guys. All right? It's the opposite problem that we have when trafficking in these commitment devices, which admittedly I also do, as I'll tell you about in a minute. But it's, you know, if someone's fully sophisticated about their limited attention problem, they presumably will have already, it's relatively easy to set up a system of reminders for yourself as opposed to a system of binding commitment devices. And we can talk more about that later. All right? And so what's nice here is that when you're developing an application, you're basically trying to treat the most clueless guys. All right? And by offering this treatment, you're less likely to do harm than when you're offering something like a commitment device. Yep.
So if I could ask another conceptual question. So when you talk about savings, I mean, I think most basically we think about savings just putting away extra cash at the end of the month into an account, right? But whenever you start saving for anything like your kid's college education or whatever, there are a number of people who talk to you about savings vehicles, right? Mutual funds. Some people may even have thought of property as a way to, quote, save money when properties were going up in value for a while. And so I'm just trying to think about, like, you're thinking about behavioral theories of undersaving. I mean, how do you make those distinctions between people thinking they're saving saving but via different vehicles. And even people try to sell people insurance policies as a way to save in terms of cash buildup. So just curious to know how you explore that.
So yeah, so people save in different ways. Sometimes people think they're saving when in fact they're not, as I'll talk about in a minute. Like, so just to preview, one of the things that I am most concerned about in this world, and one of the reasons why I am very reluctant to write policy prescriptions based on the existing body of evidence, is we just don't know yet whether when we pull a lever that gets someone to save more in this account over here, we don't know yet whether that lever is also making someone do something over here on some other part of their balance sheet that's undoing what what maybe they hope to do, which was save more, or what we hope to do, which was to get them to increase their long-run net worth. I mean, if guys are behavioral enough that when you give them this little intervention, they put more in this account, they might be behavioral enough so that they go out and undo that by taking an expensive loan so that their current consumption doesn't drop. So people save in different ways. They sometimes might think they're saving when in fact they're not. Today, so I will talk more about this issue of sort of like we need to have a handle on what's going on the balance sheet and household financial condition more broadly before we start writing policy prescriptions. I'll talk about that. What I won't talk about is the other set of issues you raised, which is asset allocation, which is sort of conditional on saving. Where do you put your money? Is it in a savings account or a CD or in your house, in durables? That's a whole other set of issues that's very important. In terms of what, and again, this is sort of my own biases and predilections in research. I'm mostly talking about what I'm doing today. I am most interested in sort of the extensive margin, which is are people actually saving at all, and how can they make decisions that increase their savings rate? And as I'll talk about, for many households, the quickest, fastest, surest, safest, most high impact thing they can do to increase their savings rate is to borrow less, and borrow less expensively. So I'll talk about that a little later. Did I do this right? Okay. So another theory of undersaving that's worth keeping in mind is overly optimistic expectations. All right. So usually these models are focus on some part of the budget constraint, perhaps it's income. They often require some sort of anticipatory utility, some optimal self-delusion to make sense, to sort of hang together. Like, it only makes sense to think about people being systematically overly optimistic if they get some benefit from thinking that the future is going to be good. I think the reason, one reason aside from sort of anecdata that these models have started to gain some traction in economics is, as is the case with the limited attention stuff, they're slightly less radical from the perspective of economics in the sense that preferences are stable. So one reason why a lot of economists are resistant to some of the self-control models is that you have these dynamically inconsistent preferences. And so economists like to think, and for good reasons, that in some deep sense at least, people sort of want what they want and that doesn't really change. Right? And we can, look, we're all human beings. We all know that human beings change and end up, liking or preferring different things as your life changes. But that's not necessarily what economists mean or work with when they think about preferences. We're arguably thinking about something, deeper than approximate thing like, whether we like beer more than wine and whether that changes as we, age from, 20 to 40. But in any case. So in theory, these models actually don't necessarily always produce oversaving, undersaving, overborrowing. Depends on income versus substitution effects, but in practice they can, it seems like they might push towards overborrowing. For example, maybe the relevant expectation is whether you're going to end up rolling over a payday loan or perpetually only making a minimum payment on your credit card. And so maybe that's the relevant expectation, that you won't do that you'll come up with the cash to pay those debts down, and so on and so forth. Maybe the main reason that this is worth mentioning in a talk like this, which will soon be focused on innovations and applications, is that there is some interest in the policy and the academic world in developing new types of disclosures that are meant to sort of de-bias any tendency people might have to be overly optimistic. Right. But again, and this is, for someone who does behavioral economics, I'm remarkably sort of grumpy and circumspect about the ability of behavioral economics to improve the world, at least at this point in time. If we take these models seriously, you don't want to de-bias people, right? Because they're getting utility from being optimistic. All right, one last theory, very quickly. And this is about biases and price perceptions that come from something that cognitive psychologists have recognized for 3 or 4 decades now, which is that people, and this is one of those things that everyone is prone to, systematically underestimate exponential growth or decline, or exponential decline. And so I think everyone knows the impact this can have when people are thinking about savings and investment. People underestimate how compound yields affect future values. People underestimate how quickly future values will grow. And this is most relevant over long horizons and at higher yields when the compounding really kicks in. What was less well known, and that Victor Stengel and I pointed out and elaborated on in one of our papers, is that this can also affect how people perceive the cost of borrowing on installment debt. And it might actually explain why installment lenders present loans as low monthly payments. Because when you see a low monthly payment and a term and a loan amount, and you try to infer an APR, what just about everyone does is they fail to adjust for how quickly they're paying off the principal. This is just like the mirror image thing. This is about exponential decline instead of exponential growth, and they perceive the APR as being much lower than it actually is. And so, and that's actually most relevant over short horizons. So it flips around from the future value. And so an application of this and this sort of work is again, it gets us thinking about new types of disclosures, or how to better enforce existing types of disclosures that would de-bias these tendencies that people seem to have to perceive certain types of loans as being cheaper than they are. So now I turn to my half-baked taxonomy of innovations and interventions. Again, many of these developed based on these behavioral theories and the related evidence, and that are designed to counter one or more of those biases. All right, and so start by talking about commitment contracts. All right, and so there are different types of commitments. All right, there are hard commitments, which take the form of the performance bond model that I described earlier, and there's some evidence that these actually increase savings, net savings, at the household level. Some evidence that they help people quit smoking. There are other times hard commitments, deadlines being a relatively hard commitment. And then we're also starting to experiment with what I think of, I don't know if this is the best word for it, but I think of it at least as softer commitments. So enlisting peer supporters, you can even think of sponsors if you want to, sort of think of this as sort of like an addiction model. Imposing small time or hassle costs. This is sort of how a lot of behavioral guys think about the power of the default option in 401ks. So, if you want to tell a procrastination story about why those defaults are so powerful, it has to be the case that, this small time or hassle cost of just calling up or going online to change your retirement contribution allocation is big enough to induce the procrastination.
Can you give an example of a performance bond?
Oh, sure. Sorry. So let me. Yeah, I'll use this. I'll use the smoking example since we haven't talked about any health stuff yet. So we went out. This joint work with Javi Ginet and Deep Power. We got a bank in the Philippines, a bank we were doing other stuff with in the Philippines, to hire marketers to go out and find smokers in the street and offer them the following product. All right. The smoker posts a performance bond. The smoker opens a savings account with the bank and puts an amount of their own choosing in this bank account. The money sits there for 6 months. At 6 months, the bank comes back, they send a tech out to give people a urine test for nicotine byproduct. Right? If the person, the smoker we found initially, passes the urine test, they get their money back. They fail the urine test, the bank keeps the money. In this case, the bank donated the money to charity, but personally, I think, well, we'll talk about revenue models for when and scalability for this kind of thing. In principle, the bank could have kept it, but they announced ex ante that they were going to donate, proceeds to charity. So that's a hard commitment. And the title of that paper was
Change behavior, you lose.
Put your money where your butt is. All right. So you are making a bet on yourself that you are going to stick to this plan or achieve this goal that you're setting for yourself. In this case, quitting smoking. So the unresolved questions here are, sort of scalability and the market test. All right. One, the first, so you give this, you give a talk on self-control problems and the demand for commitment at a place like Chicago or Wisconsin, and the first thing people will do quite rightly is stomp their feet. People, when I say people, I mean economists. Stomp their feet and say, where's the market for these commitment products? And you know what I say to that? Good point. Where is the market for these commitment products? The answer to that is, well, my co-authors and I are trying to develop a market for these commitment products, and we'll see if it works. And so many of our projects and initiatives have this flavor. And so the jury is very much still out on whether these things will pass the market test, on whether they will reach scale. But there's some cause for optimism that this can work on a wholesale basis, selling through employers. Again, Justin is doing some work along these lines as well. And I think retail as well. And I'm a bit more optimistic about prospects for doing this retail for debt reduction more than savings. The economics on the savings side is very problematic for any type of product that's targeted towards small dollar savings, just because of the fixed costs and high marginal costs of administering accounts. But for debt reduction, so what you need for a commitment product to work for debt reduction is a disinterested third party that can cheaply monitor people's borrowing behavior. So imagine giving people the opportunity to write commitments to not open a new credit card account over the next year, or to reduce their credit card balances by $1,000 over the next year, and so on and so forth. Who has the ability to do that type of monitoring cheaply? There are actually now many firms that do. You know, the credit bureaus have these credit report monitoring services. So maybe they can, you know, maybe we can convince them. We're trying to convince them to sell commitment products as part of that subscription, right? And there are potentially some other channels as well, which I can talk more about if anyone else is.
So an example of post-out from employers would be something like a bonus of your health insurance if you exercise,
exactly.
lose weight, all that.
So you know, and you know, Justin can speak to this better than I can. Kevin Volk from Wharton can speak to this better than I can. But HR departments of large employers are very motivated to invest in things that will bring down their health insurance premiums, their health insurance costs.
See, this works two ways. So another, if the poverty person thinking about this thinks of conditional cash transfers, which
right.
in a sense are a commitment in return for a commitment, meaning a bonus, not a a saving, but a
right.
bonus in term for doing a particular behavior.
Right, and to me, and again, this is partly my own bias. I do a lot less on conditional cash transfers than I do on what I would consider sort of more pure performance bond type hard commitments. To me, the only reason at this point to pursue the conditional cash transfer strategy at the expense or the exclusion of the commitment contract strategy is because is if an employer somehow feels skeevy about being that third-party enforcer of hard commitments.
I'm thinking of government as an enforcer. In other words, your kid, the traditional thing, we'll give you so much a month if your kids go to school, if your kids
No, that's
perform
I was saying.
school.
What's so let me back up. What's one of the things that's enticing about voluntary commitment contracts in aside from all the highfalutin theory is that you potentially get high-powered incentives for engaging in some desirable behavior for free or for low cost. You don't have to put that conditional cash carrot on the table to induce the behavior. So at a minimum, one thing I'm certainly interested in seeing and trying to implement going forward is, let's do conditional cash transfers and voluntary commitment contracts in the same setting and see which produces more bang for the buck. That's one. So that's one type of project where I think there would be a very big policy. There should be a big policy audience for it. So yeah, but again, I can't emphasize enough that commitment contracts are not for everyone. They're not for everyone because, first of all, not everyone wants them, right? I mean, again, you offer a product like this. Our experience so far has been, maybe 10, 20% of people in your target population will take them, and moreover, not everyone should want them. We have this very thorny problem of what to do with these folks, potentially many folks, who may only be partly sophisticated about their self-control problem, and hence only partly sophisticated about how to incentivize themselves. Right? If I'm trying to make the world a better place, I don't want someone posting a performance bond that is too little, and so that makes them unlikely to achieve their goal. And I don't want them posting a performance bond for trying to reach a goal that they're not likely to achieve because they're overly optimistic about their probability of success. And so one of the things we're only beginning to work on and think about is whether and how to bundle commitment contract offers with other interventions that help people set a sensible goal and make a sensible plan to achieve that goal. In other words, other interventions that sort of help people convert from being only partly aware of their self-control problem to being more fully aware of it. Not just qualitatively, but quantitatively. All right, sort of helping people come up with ways to better incentivize themselves to stick to their plans. All right, last question. Let's go. Yeah.
I'm curious about what kind of disclosure you think is appropriate in this commitment context. So if it's about quitting smoking, do you feel like you need to tell people that no, well, the chances are 80% that you will not be able to do this? Or
So that is exactly, that is well within the set of things that that one needs to wrestle with. So far, we haven't given those. We haven't given those disclosures. We just tell people how the product works, and so and that's not all. That's not at all crazy if we, sort of take a relatively sort of standard economic view of the world. Okay, this person wants to quit smoking. They have some idea of what their chances of quitting smoking are. We're going to offer them this product. They can take it or leave it. We're not pressuring them to take this product, but it's certainly worth thinking about. It's certainly worth testing whether we can improve success rates by saying, here's the product, here's the experience people have with the product. Maybe we can also give them some information on experiences people have without the product. What's your probability of quitting and staying quit if you don't use the product or if you use nicotine replacement? The challenge is, one thing I can say with some confidence that we know from the behavioral decision sciences is you can't overload people with information. And so there are a lot of things we might like to make sure people are informed about at any point of sale. But if you try to tell them everything, they're most likely going to take away nothing or take away the wrong thing. So, point taken, it's a matter of figuring out how to best implement it.
So I understand when you're talking about exercise, what these commitment things mean, but when we're talking about savings, there's some sense in which a payday loan is a commitment device. It says if I do something, if I take a payday loan out today, I got to pay I get punished tomorrow because I got. So if my whole concern is that people are doing stuff on Friday without thinking about the consequences on Saturday, unless I can punish you at exactly the time that you take the payday loan out,
Right.
I don't see what kind of commitment device you can get other than to somehow.
Right. So first of all, you brilliantly anticipated my next slide. But let me back up and answer the question of how you write a commitment contract over savings. All right? And so what you do, or at least there are many different varieties. One is to just give people opportunities to invest in in very illiquid assets. So that's sort of one way. Another way is offer people a savings account where they set a goal amount that they have to achieve by a certain date, right? And you just don't let them withdraw the money until they have deposited that amount. Right? That's another way of doing it. In terms of commitment contracts for not borrowing, I already talked about that a little bit. There are different ways to, in theory, to allow people to write contracts where they say, don't let me borrow, I'm not going to borrow. I think, mechanically there are ways to do it. One key question is whether you can come up with ways to do this that actually induce people to do what they want. All right, so let's assume that people are making these sorts of commitments because they want to increase their net savings rate. They want to increase their net worth. Maybe they want to make their net worth less negative. Right? But one of the issues we need to wrestle with in this space is, whether when people make commitments over this account, or even this healthy behavior, whether there is some negative spillover in other accounts, on other parts of the household balance sheet, or on other parts of the person's decision making. So, in the exercise case, it would be, well, you know, if we induce someone to exercise more with one of these commitments, are they then, you know, eating less healthy? I don't know, we should, you know, when we're doing evaluations of these things are things that in principle we should be measuring, that often don't get measured for various reasons.
I think I'm saying something different, which is that I'm worried about you can't commit 100%.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you stop 99% of people from doing the bad behavior, but the 1% still does the bad behavior. But then they get punished for the bad behavior. So the people that have the most trouble committing, if you write down a commitment contract, they break it, and then they're going to be substantially worse off.
Exactly. No, and like I said, this is one.
Yeah.
You know, this is one reason why I stopped. You know, very, very short of offering commitment contracts as any sort of panacea. It's in the toolkit, but as I said, it's problematic in part because it's an intervention that probably works least well for the people who need the most help. It's very problematic, and that's why I'm going to be talking about a bunch of other applications and innovations that potentially work better for those who are more clueless or most clueless or need the most help.
I was going to raise an issue which I think you've touched on in some of your answers to these questions, and that is that these commitment contracts seem to work best for people who are not doing something. And a person for whom they are not beneficial is somebody who is doing something. And take this as a signal that this is enough. And I'm thinking of the 401k automatic default contributions, where they've shown that people who are already contributing actually reduce their contribution to the default. So that, you know, one of the problems is the signal that people take from these, that, you know, the sophisticated people who know that they're doing all right say, oh, well, you know, this is enough for me to do. And so it's not just a 0-1, but it's
Absolutely. So
that seems to be one of the problems. Smoking is easy because you don't smoke or you smoke, but
no, but there are folks who are actively trying to quit or not trying to quit, and one important question is, you know, who are you moving, or who can you hope to move with an intervention like this?
And you don't want to move certain people from their monthly contribution to their 401k, and you give an employer.
You're making another very important point about the importance of heterogeneity in demand for commitment and the heterogeneity in effectiveness and impacts of commitment. And the punchline is, you know, for all the sizzle about commitment contracts, we know remarkably little about these very important questions. And so I'm just, you know, one thing I'm trying to give you a very graphic sense of in this talk today is, you know, there's a lot of stuff that that my co-authors and I are trying and testing, and there's a lot of stuff that other people are trying and testing, but we are just scratching the surface, just beginning to scratch the surface of actually coming up with an intervention, much less a set of innovations that we can actually, you know, stand up and confidently declare are making the world a better place. And that's why, I mean, I can just get to one of my punchlines right now. It's like, I mean, as far as behavioral economists go, I am probably the most circumspect one when it comes to writing policy prescriptions. I think we are very far from being able to write policy based on the body of evidence that we've accumulated on any of this behavioral stuff. And I'm comfortable reaching that conclusion solely based on partial equilibrium impact evaluation on decision making, which is very narrow. I would reach that conclusion without even worrying about competition and market forces and enforcement costs and enforcement problems with policy. I mean, putting aside all of sort of the usual issues that make changing policy fraught with problems and fraught with costs and unanticipated costs. I'm just purely talking about impacts on decision making. We know a lot now about how to change behavior. We don't yet know whether we're changing behavior in ways that clearly make people better off, particularly in the long run. And that's sort of among the set of sort of big questions that I'll highlight.
And I think what that does is it says, a 10%, take-up rate might be good or bad, or
We don't know.
Don't know,
I-
right. And so-
One thing it signals is that there's some demand there, and this is an application or an innovation that's worth exploring. It's worth testing. It's worth using this to try to figure out what it tells us about how people are making decisions. It's worth trying to come up with products that help people do better. We would learn something if the take-up rate was 0 or 1%. Time to go look at one of these many other things I'm hopefully going to have time to talk about. All right? So this belongs on the radar screen somewhere. 10 minutes.
Take 15 and we won't ask
So
you
much left to
questions.
do. All right, and so, here's another innovation. This is absolutely in the half-baked bin, although we just got a big grant that's going to help us implement some of these tests. So the idea is that if people form habits and/or if they're inattentive and they're borrowing, and we think they should save more, we think they might like to save more, we should be able to harness this by adding features to debt products that offer opportunities for people to sort of seamlessly transition from borrowing to saving. All right, so one idea, one version of an innovation or product feature you could add, and that we're hopefully going to be able to test based on this approach, is take someone who's paying off an installment loan and give them the opportunity to sign up ex ante to say, you know what? Once I'm done paying my loan off, I want to continue making payments into a savings account. So instead of paying my lender, I'm going to do the proverbial paying myself. All right? So that's one approach, and this could be bundled with different types of commitments that people could make or not make up front. All right? So another idea. Encourage people to do something that's quite inimical in the standard economic framework, which is to start saving while they're borrowing. So simultaneously lend low and borrow high. Why might you, how can you do this? Well, what's striking, shocking, arguably shameful, is that, this microfinance movement all over the world that they're handing out Nobel Peace Prizes to honor, most of these MFIs require people to do this. Right? It's basically a way of raising the interest rate in sort of a way that's stealthy to borrowers and regulators. They require this, what I would think of as sort of a positive delta. It's like you get your loan amount, but then you also have to contribute some into a savings account each month. And what microfinance institutions will say when they're trying to cover their butts is, oh, we're just building good habits around saving, right? And so this is something that should be tested, not just because it's being implemented in practice, but because we can learn something about it, about habit formation and potentially limit attention as well. All right, so someone mentioned defaults. This is often viewed as maybe the single greatest triumph of applied behavioral economics in terms of the dramatic effects on 401k enrollment. As was pointed out, need to choose defaults with care. And to my mind at least, there are still very important unanswered questions that, again, personally I would have been more circumspect before going and changing pension rules and policy based on the existing evidence. But because we don't still have great evidence on whether this actually increases net saving, maybe people are contributing more to their 401ks but going out and borrowing on their credit cards. All right? The long run effects of that, if that's the steady state impact of this intervention, that is not good news. all right? And there's some interesting work on sort of getting people to be less passive and more actively engaged in these decisions. And then, of course, you know, much like the commitment lever, this is just not something that is viable in every setting, or even in most settings. You know, we typically can't change the default in a way that moves people in their desired direction or in the policymaker's desired direction. So again, this is just one of many things in the toolkit. Upfront disclosures, I mentioned, we talked a little about disclosures that are designed to counter excess optimism. I mean, people are just beginning to work on this. Countering biased price perceptions. I don't know. We can talk about mandated APR disclosure and SEC rules on if people are interested, or I can move on. Again, far more questions than answers here. All right. And one thing I would highlight as a particularly interesting opportunity for enterprising grad students out there is this question about shrouded prices when we have nonlinear and state contingent contracting. Some very interesting work to be done that could tie back really nicely to some of the highfalutin theories on whether you can on whether you can debias people and get them to attend to these future state contingent prices, and whether firms can do it in a way that gives them a profitable deviation. All right. So the interesting theory is basically all about why firms don't do the debiasing themselves. Innovations in marketing and social marketing. I think, you know, savings decisions. You know, as my co-authors and I have done a bit in the borrowing space, savings decisions are good margins for studying how advertising works. Is it more persuasive or more informative? I say this because, you know, there's natural opportunities to do some direct marketing and social marketing. It's a commodity product, so we don't have to worry about a lot of the product differentiation that we have to do in other product markets when we're trying to learn something about how advertising works. And there are some key predictions that can be tested. Yeah, I should say something about messaging because I'm doing a lot of stuff on this. And so let me just make a quick distinction between a reminder and information. So a reminder is not news. A reminder is just a nag to do something that you plan to do already. And so one thing that comes quite strikingly out of these limited attention models that's absent from other behavioral models is that there is a role for reminders, at least for people who have some sort of limited attention problem and are not savvy enough to have figured out, you know, how to solve it with their PDAs or their spouses or their day planners or whatever. And so our first little test of this was sending out reminders, text messages in most cases, to clients of banks and new clients of banks in 3 different developing countries, and people who got reminders to make savings deposits they had planned up front to make were more likely to make those deposits. And reminders that mentioned a specific goal that the client had had in mind and written down and set out when they signed up for the account, those reminders seem to be incrementally effective. But, I mean, so here's a graphic example of why, you know, we're not ready to go out and start writing policy prescriptions or strategy prescriptions based on these findings. Because, in part because this was a pilot, we didn't have data on what was going on in the rest of the household balance sheet. So we don't know we only know that this intervention, these reminders, increase savings in a particular savings account. We don't know if this crowded out other savings. We don't know how it affected asset allocation. We don't know if people went out and borrowed from loan sharks to maintain their current level of consumption.
Do you think that's likely?
I think, so here's my point. Okay, I'm glad you asked that because in rushing, I overlooked sort of the key conceptual or philosophical, theoretical point about this. If someone is behavioral enough to respond to one of these clever interventions we come up with, based on behavioral theory, whether it's a reminder or a commitment contract or whatever, if they're behavioral enough to respond to something like this, might they not be behavioral in a way that when we nudge them to do something over here, they just go out and unthinkingly do something perverse over here? So it's like, all right, you send me a reminder to save, so I put more in my deposit. But maybe I need reminders to save because I just go along day to day and I have these savings goals, but I don't really think about them. They're not at top of mind. And so the reminder momentarily makes the savings goal closer to top of mind, so I make that savings deposit. But when I go around day to day, I'm getting all these stimuli encouraging me to spend. I have all these spending opportunities, and so I just spend what I have in my wallet without thinking. And maybe there are easy opportunities to borrow without thinking much either. And so basically I just keep my consumption constant. And so I'm saving more over here, but I'm doing something to keep my consumption constant, which means I'm probably borrowing from somewhere. And I'm probably saving at 2% APY, and I'm borrowing at 18%, 100%, 300% APR. That, I mean, even if you think there's only a 20% probability that that's happening, I mean, that's a bad outcome. That is not what we want to be doing here. And so, and the way I view this is like, the first thing to test is whether our model of how the world works makes some sense and whether we can move behavior. But before we start rewriting regulations, we need to know whether we can actually improve behavior doing stuff like this. That's my point. And it comes, and for me, this comes straight from taking the theory really seriously. Does that make sense? Should I wrap up? All right.
Finish with 5 slides.
I promised I would get to. Oh, I didn't get to talk about the killer. All right. So. All right. So these are the 5 slides. Big questions going forward. One. So we need a workhorse behavioral model. All right. So one problem that Chicago guys and policymakers alike have with behavioral economics is that it's just a bunch of different little models about different biases and limitations. And there's no portable model you can drop into any policy relevant situation and use to sort of think through rigorously what might happen if you intervene in some way. Right? And this is like the single most legitimate criticism and limitation of behavioral economics. We're victims of our own success. We're too much like the psychologists. Right? There are all these incredibly rich things that affect and limit people's ability to make good decisions. All right? But we don't know how these factors are related to each other. And consequently, we don't know what absolutely needs to be in our predictive models of behavior. And so one of the things we need to do, and one of the things that we are starting to do, is we need descriptive evidence on how these different decision-making failings and biases are correlated with each other. And I think there's an interesting analogy to the decades and decades of research that have been done on mental abilities and intelligence. So it took those cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists a while to figure it out, but there's a strong common factor in different types of mental abilities, now referred to as the G factor. And so we need to figure out whether there's something like this with all of these behavioral biases. Because if there is a common factor, we might be able to figure out how to parameterize it and just put one behavioral thing into our model, and that's something we can work with. All right? And closely related questions are, which of these things are most strongly correlated not with each other, but with real-world outcomes and decisions. All right. So, this is just a massive project. All lots of work to be done on this. Slightly less ambitious is questions about the market for advice. So a lot of this stuff potentially goes out the door. A lot of concerns about the economic importance in market equilibrium of all of these decision-making limitations that we all are potentially prone to. A lot of that goes out the door if we have a well-functioning market for advice. All right? And one, depressing or exciting thing, research-wise, is how little we understand about how well the market for advice works or doesn't work. I mean, sort of descriptively and anecdotally, it certainly doesn't seem to be working that well. But why is it failing? And what can we do to make it work better? And so some specific sub-questions here that are really important on the consumer side are about willingness to pay and whether willingness to pay is movable. Because anecdotally, when you talk to guys who are in this business or potentially in this business, they're like, I've got great advice. I've got a great advice model. I just can't get ordinary people willing to pay anything for it. People expect to get advice for free. So that's an important question too. And one of my pet peeves is that to the extent that we have markets for advice, at least in the US, they're, for understandable economic reasons, they're quite focused on the asset side of the household balance sheet. But, I mean, if people are misallocating, the big money is on the liability side. All right, third big question going forward. I've already touched on this, which is doing a better job of measuring outcomes more holistically before we declare victory about declare victory for a given application or intervention. And so, unfortunately, that's easier said than done, or else it would have already been done. The big issue is cost. We can't always be running around doing extensive, detailed household surveys that measure everything under the sun. That's incredibly expensive. Possible solutions that we're working on, online surveys, doing the work within the context of detailed household surveys, of trying to come up with summary statistics for financial condition. So can we get at a household's financial condition just by asking them about it in one or two summary questions? How do answers to those questions correlate with more objective, quantitative type measures that we would be able to collect with a detailed household survey if we have the money? So that's another track. Turns out, as we've recently learned and used, you can get great data from credit reports by getting permission from people to do soft pulls of credit reports. This gives you a nice picture of the liability side of the balance sheet for many people, as well as their credit scores. So that's better than what we've been able to do in most cases so far. And there are these firms, I didn't get a chance to talk about sort of the killer app thing, but we're starting to do work with firms that are in the business of aggregating people's financial information. All right, so there are all these startups, the Mint.coms and Hello Wallets of the world, they're providing services that potentially have a big behavioral component to them, where people sign up, hand over access to their online accounts so that the third-party aggregator can help them track their financial information. And so if that third party gets consent up front to share anonymized data with researchers, well, bingo. And so that's another track we're pursuing. Right? So I think this is big question. Yeah, big question 4. This is, we've touched a little bit on this already. What do the effects of these types of innovations or interventions look like in equilibrium? All right, so we've talked remarkably little about the effects of competition, about regulation with limited enforcement. What does the steady state look like? Most of this, the studies of these interventions, including my own, it's all about, what happens in partial equilibrium. All right, and we need to think hard about what happens in the longer run. This means, grad students, this means that there are big gains from trade to be had with industrial organization, as other behavioral economists have pointed out quite ably. but also public finance and I think even asset pricing and other fields that are really good at modeling general equilibrium. All right, and finally, again, thinking more broadly than we often do, complementarities with other domains of intertemporal choice. So for example, we've talked a bit about health decisions and that there are very natural complementarities and positive spillovers in the research world between thinking about similarities between health and finance in terms of the importance of low frequency, high stakes decisions in both domains, and also the importance how in both domains there are these countless high frequency, day to day, hour to hour, small stakes decisions that add up over time. So I think that is more than enough. Thank you for...
Yeah, well, hopefully you get a sense of the excitement, the enthusiasm, and the broad scope that this field can head. So that's partly what our center is going to be engaged in, are some of these tough questions, and we hope that this is fuel that fire a little bit. Maybe we'll bake these ideas a little bit more. So join me in thanking John, and we're going to have reception here. In just a minute, so.
Those of you, he's been interesting enough to keep you 7 or 8 minutes over, which normally doesn't happen here at all. But there is a reward for you, not that it's going to give you a long but there's some treats over there. We hope you'll
Conditional cookie transfer.
Hey.